So welcome everybody to this, the first of our Google Hangouts and Researcher Meets for the Coursera Animal Behavior MOOC. We're very lucky today to be able to have a chat in person with Professor Marlene Zook, who's agreed to join us for a little while to talk about her research. And what I'd like to do in a moment is just ask Marlene to introduce herself and to tell us a little bit about her background. And then we might go through the chat room to find out a little bit more about each of the people that are participating in the Hangout. So over to you, Marlene. Welcome.
Thanks. I have to admit that sounds a little rocky. I can just barely make out what you're saying. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah? Everybody's all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure, good. Okay, so maybe I'm having more trouble hearing you than you are hearing me. Thanks for having me. I was excited when Raul invited me to do this. So I'm pleased to be joining you. I'm an evolutionary biologist, a behavioral ecologist, and my main affiliation is at the University of Minnesota in the U.S. I'm visiting Australia for a few weeks now, which is why it was a bit more convenient for me to coordinate with Raul. I have been a professor for a long time. I work mostly on insects, and my main interests in animal behavior are in sexual selection and animal communication. I mostly work on insects, and I decided to bring one of my subjects here. I don't know if you can see it. This is a cricket. Part of why I'm in Australia is to do more research on this cricket, which is sometimes called the Pacific field cricket, sometimes called the Australian field cricket, and it just looks like a little black bug. I don't know how well you can see it.
Hold it up a little higher. Yeah, that's perfect.
There you go. Looks like a cricket, doesn't it? All right. Anyway, and we can talk more about exactly what I'm doing with them as this goes on, but that's really why I'm here. I collaborate with a professor here, Lee Simmons, who I've been working with for many, many years and whom Raul knows as well, and who actually also would be a great contributor to what you all are doing.
Thank you, Marlene. We might just go briefly around the room and just find out a little bit about each of the people that have joined us today. And so maybe you can tell us your name, where you're from, and a little bit about why you're interested in animal behavior. Can I start with you, Absent?
Hello, everyone. My real name is Paula, but my nickname is Athens. I'm studying biology at the University of Valais, and I'm pretty interested in animal behavior. It's my passion, and I would like to integrate the. I'm sorry. I would like to see the not just animal every system. Uh, I don't pretty sure if I make understand.
That's fine, thank you.
Sure.
What about you, Bella?
It's morning here, about to be 12 soon, so good morning everyone. My name is Bela Arora. I'm from Punjab in India, and in August I'm going to join this National Center for Biological Sciences for a JRF position, and under Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan. She works on the phylogenetics of birds and mammals. So as Rahul knows that I've taken this course even last year and a year before that as well. So I am interested in animal behavior, and sexual selection was one of the topics, I'm really interested in. Good to be in this hangout. Thank you.
Thanks, Bella. Janet, your microphone seems to be switched off. I'm not sure if that's an accident. Are you there?
No, here we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm calling in from Paris. I'm actually American, but I live in Paris, and I do technical writing as a profession, and studying or learning about evolutionary biology is a hobby and a passion. So that's why I'm here to listen. In particular, animal behavior interests me, and so that's why I'm listening today.
Wonderful, Janet. Thanks very much. Laura. Are you there, Laura? Laura? You've got to Laura briefly and go to Meret.
Hello?
Hello.
I just joined, so I don't really know what's going
Hi,
on.
sorry, we're just introducing each other, and so maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and why you're interested in behavior.
I'm from Minnesota, but I currently live in Seattle, Washington. I'm interested in animal behavior just because I'm interested in animals in general and how they function and evolve, and I'm just really interested in learning about most of all sciences, if I can.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Over to, I'm sorry, I've just got your username here as Romulo MMC.
Yeah, that's because EMMC is the last name, but it's Romulo, whatever you want to pronounce that.
And so, where are you from, Romulo?
I'm Brazilian, so the pronunciation would be Romulo, but be free to pronounce it the way you guys would like. I'm Brazilian. I'm a student. I'm doing a master's degree in ecology right now. Although what I really like is evolution, but my university doesn't have a department in evolutionary biology, unfortunately. But I'm currently working with plumage coloration, evolution. It's a family. I'm working with birds, and I started this project with Richard Brum. Maybe you guys know him from Yale University.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I went to his laboratory because I lived in the United States for a year doing a abroad program. So we started a project with coloring, plumage coloration, a family of birds that's called Pichida. You probably don't know about it, but now I'm working with reproduction. And what I actually really like is sexual selection. So my PhD, and I got an approval like 2 months ago. I'm going to Oxford to study with Tom Pizzari. I don't know if you know him.
Yes.
I do.
Yeah, so he works with post-copulatory sexual selection. So that's my interest. I love to understand a little bit about the mechanism underpinning sexual selection, female choice, sperm competition. That's everything that I like. So basically, that's my subject.
All right. Thank you, Romulo. That's great. Over to Sakshi.
Hi everyone, I'm Sakshi Rana and I live in New Delhi, India. And I just completed my master's in environmental science and I wish to pursue a PhD in wildlife biology and conservation. So animal behavior has sort of intrigued me because we can't talk to animals because of course we can't understand their language and they can't understand ours. But the behavior they show can be like sort of a sign that we can understand to know what they're trying to say or what they're trying to do. So in that way, I really wish to know more about this subject. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakshi. And last but not least, Sebastian.
Hey, well, I'm from Colombia. I actually study computer science, but I'm interested in animal behavior because I have always been interested in biology in general, and behavior in particular because the main thing I like of my career is to be able of simulating things, complex systems, and I think this course will help me understand the complexity of the living things in terms of its behavior. Um, uh, One of my passions have always been insects, entomology, so it's great to have Marlene with us today.
Wonderful, thank you, Sebastian. Now, I'm very keen to just be in the background and to leave the room over to you guys to ask whatever you want to. So let's try and just open the room. Does anybody have a question they'd like to start with?
Well, if nobody, I have a question, but unfortunately, I wanted to read two different papers that I couldn't from prom, because I know he's not that. He doesn't like the idea of the sexual selection mechanism of good genes and all that. He prefers the Fisherian model of, let's say, runaway selection. I'd like to know, because there's been a while since I last read about the different mechanism underpinning sexual selections, like good genes, runaway, sexy sons. I'd like to know, in general, which mechanism is actually being more supported. How is this discussion? You know, like those Wallace versus Darwin discussion between aesthetics is actually it does happens. Is selection working? You know, this kind of discussion. I would like to know just a little bit what is going on in the between the researchers right now.
A nice gentle opening for you, Marlene.
Sure. Probably we should back up a little bit, just because I realize that everybody else might not have as much background as Sebastian does. And so the idea is, all right, a lot of us who work in sexual selection are interested in why it is that in many different kinds of animals you get all these crazy features like peacock tails or incredibly bright plumage, you know, in other kinds of birds, or in insects you get the males that are producing these loud songs and so on and so forth. And that's interested people, well, since before Darwin. And Darwin's idea was, okay, the reason that and often, though not always, the differences are such that the males are the ones that have the elaborate characters and are larger, whereas the females tend to be smaller and drabber. And again, that's not always the way it is, but that is a fairly general rule. Okay, so Darwin said, look, and Darwin was hugely interested in sex, and so I'm actually glad you brought up the Darwin-Wallace thing, because I think a lot of people don't realize that although Darwin, of course, came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, he was incredibly interested in sex, and he was interested in how all of this could work to produce the sexual differences we see. All right, so he said, look, there are two ways that you can end up with there being differences between males and females. One of them is because the males fight with each other for access to the females, and so you end up with horns and antlers on deer and other ungulates. You end up with large body size in, say, elephant seals. You end up with males that are just good at fighting, and so that's why you see that sort of sexual difference. The other, and people were like, oh yeah, sure, we get that all seems very reasonable, and Wallace was on board with that as well. The alternative, however, people were not so happy with, and that was Darwin saying, look, there are weapons, but then there are also what you're going to call ornaments, which are things like colorful plumage or, you know, the tail on the peacock, where it's great that we've got somebody from India, you know, because peacocks have been such an icon for all of this for so many years. And so the idea is, okay, if you have this tail on the peacock, well, the males are not bashing each other on the head with their tails. They're instead using them in some kind of display. And so Darwin said, well, the reason they came about is because the females prefer them. And that idea was really mocked by a lot of Darwin's contemporaries, including Wallace, who just said, come on, this is ridiculous. Females can't possibly have enough, basically enough sense to be able to discriminate one male from the other. And some of it, you know, a lot of people have said, and I kind of agree with them, that that was partly because of the social environment at the time, that, you know, people just didn't want to give females much credit for being able to do much of anything, including choose a mate based on how long his tail was or how bright his feathers were or something like that. And so they thought that whole idea was ridiculous, and it kind of lay fallow for a really long time until it got picked up again more or less in the middle of the 20th century. So it was a long time when no one was really very interested in sexual selection. Okay, now I am getting to your question. I promise I'm getting to your question. Okay, so then the idea was, well, we can understand that female choice could be important, and that had to do with the different kinds of investment that females make in their offspring versus males. But then it could just work that females happen to prefer who they prefer for no particular reason. Or it could be that males with the longer tails or the brighter colors actually are also better able to survive, and so they're picking them because of some general vigor, some general ability to live their lives that the other males with the shorter tails don't have. And this became a subject of some contention, with some people saying, well, it can work just fine. All you need is a little bit of a jump start, and you can have females preferring slightly longer tails, and then that'll give an advantage to both the males that have the longer tails and the daughters that they have that will inherit the preference, and so you'll end up with this kind of snowballing effect. And then other people saying, no, 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 actually the male would do much better if he can only produce this long tail or this elaborate plumage if he is also of very good health and well able to manufacture this ornament, because the ornaments are very often costly. They're costly physiologically to produce. They're also something that may expose the males more to predation, and that's something that, in fact, I work on in the crickets that I showed at least some of you a little bit ago, so cricket. And I can talk about that in a little bit if anybody's interested. And I think that right now, where I would judge this, and I only have my own opinion, is that you can certainly argue that there are cases where you can model convincingly that only a difference between males that is arbitrary and that has nothing to do with the condition can result in the exaggeration of a character. But we also have a lot of instances, and actually the peacocks are one, where females that pick males that have more exaggerated characters also have offspring that survive better. So it's not going to, I don't think it's ever going to be an either-or situation, because we have empirical evidence that says sometimes good gene sexual selection works. That was a hugely long-winded answer to your question, but I think giving the background is perhaps helpful to the rest of you who might not have thought about this before. But this was a big discussion among biologists who said, look, how are we going to explain these sexual differences? And there's always this temptation to say, oh, I'm sure it's functional, everything has to be functional, but in fact things can evolve based on kind of arbitrary starting conditions and go from there. Raul, I've stunned them into silence.
Yeah, very compelling answer. Tell me a little bit more about your background. How did you get involved in studying animal behavior? Is it something, a passion you've had since you were 3 years old, or did you come to it relatively late?
So I think a little bit of both. So I liked animals ever since I was a child, but I think most children like animals. And I think it didn't occur to me until much later in my education that that could actually mean that one could do this for a living. Like, it just seemed like something that I liked. And I think it's hard to get exposure, because my parents were not college educated. My parent, I didn't grow up in an environment where it seemed like becoming an academic was not a thing. I'd never been exposed to college professors until I went to university myself. And so it took me a long time to decide that, oh, actually this was something you could do, that you didn't, if you were interested in science, you didn't have to necessarily become an engineer or a doctor. You could actually do something that just involved studying a subject you were interested in. So I've always had the interest in animals, but I think it took me a long time to realize that this was something I could apply to an actual career. I think there's probably some people who still are dubious about the idea that you can apply it to an actual career.
And what's your sense? You've obviously seen a lot of change in the field. Where do you think the field is at? What sort of advice would you have for somebody that was contemplating embarking on a career in animal behavior, behavioral ecology?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because at least in the United States, and I can only talk about the United States because that's a system that I'm most familiar with, but there's a lot of concern about lack of funding for basic research, for example, so that if you want to do research that isn't directly health related, or it's not directly something that you can apply, the funding for this is getting very scarce. And I think this is a terrible mistake, because the only way we ever have anything to apply is by people doing basic research that had no idea what was going to happen to it. And so in terms of thinking about a career, I think you have to be realistic to people and say, look, it's going to be a difficult place to go, because you aren't going to have people falling all over themselves to give you money to study cricket sacks. I mean, I can tell you that for a fact. But there are not lots of people who want to shower you with many, thousands and thousands of dollars to work on cricket sacks. And at the same time, I feel, very strongly that it's incredibly important for people to be promoting not just science research, but also the idea that people have to understand how science works. They have to be literate in science and the scientific process, or they're going to have a hard time making all kinds of decisions about their lives. Someone's going to say, oh, here, try this crazy diet, or try this, like I have an aunt who had cancer and who cured herself by, eating this or that. And unless you understand how science works, it's very difficult to evaluate claims like that.
I'm just wondering whether there's anybody else that's interested in contributing to that discussion, or has struggled with some of these questions themselves. No?
Sorry? I'm curious about your studies on the crickets. What are your most important discoveries, or the ones that you are so most proud of?
Yeah, and so I think so. This is actually one. So I think thanks. Actually, that's a great question. I think because it'll allow me to sort of show you why I think being able to do basic research is it's a real privilege and it's really exciting for me. So I was. So I won't get into how I started working on crickets because that's actually really quite a long story. But I ended up kind of by accident studying the crickets that I do, and so I'll just give you a little bit of the background on that, which is that, so the crickets I study, the species is called Teleobrylus oceanicus, and as I said, I do think it's quite fun that I can show you this. So here they are. This is a female, actually, and she's in a little box, because we're about to do something actually kind of nasty to her, but in any event, so they're kind of subtropical, and they occur all through the northern part of Australia and then the Pacific Islands, places like Fiji, Tahiti, Samoa. They've been introduced by people to Hawaii. Now, in Hawaii, but only in Hawaii, they get a parasitic fly. The fly has kind of a unique ability among flies because it can hear the song that the males produce. Now, male crickets produce songs. I mean, if you go outside at night, wherever you are in the world almost, depending on the time of year, you will hear an insect singing. And the insect you will hear singing is, like 99.9% of the time, is going to be a male that's singing to attract a female. Okay, so when he does that, in these populations in Hawaii, the male also can attract this parasitic fly. And the fly then lands somewhere near the cricket and deposits larvae that are very tiny, and they're also sticky, and they burrow inside the cricket's body. So they'll go into it like a thin place on the cuticle. They'll burrow inside, and they'll grow and develop while the cricket is still alive, consuming, as my student refers to it, the gooey bits, and just eating him slowly from the inside out. And then eventually, after a week or so, the fly larva has grown to full size, bursts out, pupates in the soil, and then eventually becomes an adult fly. So the cricket is necessary as a host for the parasitic fly. I'm interested in this because from the cricket's perspective, from the male's perspective, it means that he's in this dilemma. From the point of view of sexual selection, the more he calls, the better, because that's going to increase his mating success, because that's how he attracts females. From the point of view of natural selection, the more he calls, the worse off he is, because that means he's more likely to attract this deadly fly. And so I've been interested for many years, as a lot of biologists are, in what happens when you have conflicting selection pressures. So selection is pushing the male to sing less, but it's also pushing the male to sing more. And a lot of my research over the last 20 years has been to try and understand what happens when you have opposing selection forces. Now, on to the sort of interesting discovery. So I worked on this for a number of years in Hawaii and in other places, trying to understand why you have variation in behavior, what the males could do to maybe avoid getting parasitized, whether females could do anything, and so on and so forth. And if people are interested, I'm happy to tell you more about that in a little bit. But right now, the interesting part, and the part that was kind of, in my opinion, a really cool discovery, is that maybe about 10 years ago, or a little bit more than that now, we had noticed that on one of the islands in Hawaii where we work, the island of Kauai, the population of crickets had gotten very small, and I was actually able to find very few when I would go there to do field work. So then one time I thought, it is an introduced system, so maybe, it's just not very dynamic, or rather it's very dynamic, and so it's just not very stable, and so maybe the population is just going to crash, because, it happens, things go extinct. And so I went there one year and thought, okay, maybe I just won't find any, and indeed I didn't hear a thing, because of course you try to find crickets by listening for them. But you may as well get out of the car. And so we started walking to the field where I usually find them, and all of a sudden in my headlamp I started seeing all these crickets, but I wasn't hearing anything. And so you have to understand that if you're a person who works on crickets, this is like, it was like a moment of cognitive dissonance, because a cricket's whole reason for living is, a male. They always sing. That's what they do. It's how they can find a mate, and crickets sing. If it's night and there are crickets, you hear crickets. Well, it was night and there were crickets, but I wasn't hearing crickets, and so, honestly, it was really, I was picking them up and thinking, maybe there's some strange other kind of insect. No, these are my crickets. These are the ones I work on. Maybe I've gone deaf. No, I hadn't gone deaf. And so it took me a while to figure this out, because there were more crickets than I'd ever seen in that site before. But eventually, what emerged was that the crickets on that island, a large proportion of the males had a mutation in that expressed itself by making their wings differently structured, so they could no longer call. I wish I had I wish I could show you, the pictures of what this looks like, but it's in some of my papers if you want to look them up. And it's really cool. So crickets call by rubbing their wings together. So you can imagine. So there's a structure. Hopefully everybody can see my hands here. So there's like a structure on the back of one wing that rubs against the structure on the underside of the other wing, and so they go like this, and they raise their wings a little bit, and that's what makes the sound. And it's a little bit like the sound you would make if you ran your fingernail across the teeth of a comb. So it goes like that. Okay. So they have very specialized structures that allow them to do this. They have something called a file and a scraper, and then the males also have these modified wing bangs that amplify the sound, that are kind of like, they look sort of like a big drum that help to reverberate when the sound is being produced, and so that amplifies the sound and makes it louder. These new mutants had none of that. Their wings look almost exactly like female wings, but in every other respect, they're normal males. And so what had happened, as we put together finally after I got over feeling my cognitive dissonance, is that there had been an incidence of incredibly rapid evolution happening on that island. And so and we calculated this out, and we've done it in a number of ways, within about 20 generations, we had gone from crickets that had normal wing morphology to a bunch of crickets that 90% of which bore this wing mutation that made them completely unable to call. So this is really cool from a whole bunch of perspectives. What I was interested in, since I'm a behavioral ecologist, is, well, okay, not calling for a male is great from the standpoint of protecting you from the fly, which it really does. It completely makes them, because it's like they're invisible to the flies, because the flies only hunt by sound. So the flies can only find their prey by listening. And if they can't hear anything, then they won't find the cricket. So this is great, but it poses an obvious problem in terms of mate attraction, and it's even more complicated than I have been saying, because in addition to attract females from a distance to come in from a long way away, when a male cricket attracts a female cricket and she's in contact with him, they rub their antennae on each other and they get some chemical cues that way. But also, the male produces a different song called a courtship song that, is supposedly at least necessary for the male to produce before the female will go ahead and mate with the male and receive a sperm package from him and get her eggs fertilized. These males can't produce either of these songs, so, and yet they're still crickets. So what are they doing? And that's pretty much, again, what for the last several years, what we've been trying to figure out is what happens as a result of this rapid evolutionary change that you see. And but it was super cool to see. You know, this was like watching evolution happen in front of your eyes, because it was 5 years, and where we've gone from, you know, pretty much none of these flatwings, as we call them, to about 90% on Kauai, and so it just happened right in front of us. It was evolution, because we saw the spread of a new trait. And so that was pretty exciting, and it's something that I completely stumbled across. I mean, obviously, you can't control that sort of thing. And it is really neat. And what I really like about it is that, you know, I always feel like when I go to Hawaii to do the field work that, you know, I know this thing that's going on there that most people have no idea about. And I also realize that most people who go to Hawaii don't really care about that sort of thing, because the last thing they're concerned about is how the crickets are finding mates when they go to Hawaii, because all they want to do is, you know, lie on the beach and maybe have a nice drink. But still, I feel like it's really exciting, because it's like the secret that I have.
But what happened to the flies? Did they have any other host?
That's a great question. So the flies are still persisting, and what we think is happening. The flies don't need to find. I mean, insects, as you know, don't need to eat very often, and they can live for a while without, you know, finding the host. Although it's a little bit mysterious to me, because the flies have no other hosts in Hawaii, at least. There's no other crickets that they could live on, so it's a bit mysterious to me how all of this works. The flies are still persisting, and there are no populations of the crickets that are completely with the new mutant. They all have just a few of the males, at least a few of the males that can call. And on another island on Oahu, there's about 50-50. So it's half males with the trait and half males with the new trait and half males that are normal callers. And what we think is happening is that there's this very intricate balance with the way selection is working, so that the males that are protected from the fly live longer, but the males that call anyway get more mates, and so they have more offspring in the short term, but the other ones can last longer, and so there's still males around for the flies to find, but there's just fewer of them. And so it's kind of this race for the males that can call to get a mate before they're killed, basically, by the fly. So the flies are still there. It's really cool, because you can put out a trap. You put out well, you know, basically we just take a 2-liter bottle from soda and you cut it in half, and you put the narrow end inside the other part of it, and you tape it over a speaker that's broadcasting cricket song. And the flies will come in and they fly through the narrow part, and then they can't get out, so you can trap them that way. And it's just amazing, because, you know, the flies are so good at localizing the cricket song, and people have worked on this who are interested actually in how sound localization works, because the flies, they're maybe the size of a small house fly, so, you know, they're not very big, but they're not like Drosophila or something, so they're a reasonable size. You never see them unless you play, you know, a cricket song. And my student that I took there once, we put out a trap, and I told her to go and check it, and she came like running back and saying, "Oh my God, there's like 14 of them on there. I don't understand. Like, what you like, but they're really big. Like, how come I've never seen them?" And I said, "Well, you don't have anything they want. I mean, why would they be attracted to you? You don't sing like a cricket." And it's funny, because they're for all I know, there's lots of them, but you never see them unless you play cricket song.
How have these calling males survived then? They're at low density, but they're very easy to find. Why haven't they gone extinct?
Because the females would really, 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 really rather mate with a male that can produce a song. We've done trials in the lab, and there's been some selection on the females from Hawaii to tolerate males that, you know, go ahead and mate with males that won't produce a courtship song. But you can do cross-population studies, and you can put. We did one. Well, my student, you know, who spent hours and hours and hours in a dark room watching through red light whether crickets were mating or not. You can look and see like whether males from Tahiti or males from the Marquesas or males from Australia will be more likely to mate with males that don't produce a courtship song, and invariably the males from, or the females from Kauai will be more likely to do it, but even you can get them to mate about 40% of the time. And if a male produces a courtship song, then like 80 or more % of them will go ahead and mate. So it's a huge mating advantage to the males that do still call, and that seems to be enough to counterbalance their survival cost.
Is it possible for these wild-type forms to go extinct someday? Because parasitic fly is always going to follow them.
Yeah, it certainly is. And every time I go to Hawaii, I wonder what's going to happen next, because it's absolutely possible for them to go extinct. And then, of course, then the whole population, I think, would just die out, because it would be everybody wandering around in this field unable to find each other.
So with the decrement in the population of wild type, perhaps the population of parasitic fly would have also decreased, right?
Yeah, we've wondered about that, and the problem is it's very difficult to assess population levels, because usually that we only find a few, there isn't enough variation in population numbers for us to be able to gauge that differences at that scale. But yeah, we've wondered about that a bunch. Yeah, that's a really good question.
Marlene, have you tried to model that? Maybe doing some kind of a evolutionary stable strategy,
Yes,
some game theory?
Yeah.
To see what is going to happen in the future?
We have a paper on, well, I've got a paper on that came out a few months ago, and we're continuing to work on it. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is whether we can figure out why you get different, apparently stable proportions of the two different types of males on the different Hawaiian islands. Because right now there's 3 islands, one of which has almost all of these flatwings, one of which has about 50%, and the third of which, like every time we go, we'll find 1 or 2 flatwings, sometimes none, sometimes 4, but they never seem to really get a foothold. And so that's exactly what we're doing now, is trying to model this and figure out, well, can we predict based on, so we're looking at the contribution of things like the density of crickets in general, the sex ratio, the actual advantage or disadvantage you have of being a satellite, like being a male that just hangs around other males that call versus being a caller, and so forth. But yeah, we're trying to figure that out, because again, it's enabling you to be able to predict how evolution will work, which seems really cool.
So
how would you, please
go on. That's all right. Cool.
I was just asking, how would you measure fitness in this situation? How can you do that, and how are you thinking about doing that?
You mean
in the trade-off?
Theoretically,
yeah, the
or in the field, or in the lab? I mean, we use mating success as as a proxy for fitness most of the time, and certainly in our model, we're looking at number of females mated with as a proxy for fitness. I do have, so right now I have a student. One of the things I'm interested in is the extent to which females do prefer males that have this that can call in the field, and so it's a little complicated, because we know that the flatwing trait, it's controlled by a single gene that's sex-linked, and because of the way sex determination works in crickets, that means that in order to see which type of male a female has mated with, you need to look not at her offspring, but her grand offspring. And so you need a somewhat complicated experimental design. But given that you can do that, what we're interested in is seeing, okay, we've taken a bunch of females from the field, we're rearing up all of their offspring, and we're looking at the proportions of the offspring of those offspring to see whether we can then back calculate how many relative numbers of normal wing versus flatwing males that she's mated with. And that way we will have an empirical answer to your question, which is to say, okay, we know what the relative frequencies in the field are of the flatwings and the normal wings, so we should be able to calculate what the sexual selection advantage is of being a male that can call by seeing how disproportionately more normal wing offspring are produced by a female. So And we don't have the answer to that yet. She's been rearing. It requires a lot of cricket rearing. We've got a lot of boxes of little tiny baby crickets in the lab. So stay tuned. I will be able to answer your question hopefully in maybe 6 months.
All right, thank you.
So you said there's one island on which there are these flap wings, which are very few in number. Is that island not infested by the flies yet?
Wait, sorry, I understood the first part of your question, and then the last part you got sort of blurry on the thing.
Okay, so the island with the least number of flap-winged crickets, is that island not infested by the parasitic flies yet?
So no, it's got the fly. Why it is on one island we saw it a lot and another we didn't is I have absolutely no idea, and I've wondered about that a lot. I mean, what I think happens is that there really is, to get back to actually the question about arbitrary versus adaptive models of sexual selection, I mean, there really are a lot of just random events that happen, and so the way I'm imagining it now is that these mutations just kind of, you know, like burble up and then disappear, and very rarely they're just in exactly the right circumstance where, you know, a male bearing the mutation will end up achieving really high success, and then the mutation will be able to get a foothold and spread. But the rest of the time, a male, just for whatever reason, has a developmental mutation, he can't call, he becomes an adult, he, you know, unable to call, he's never selected by a female, and he dies, and so do his genes. Another male does that, he dies, so do his genes. So I think it's more a question of not so much why is it that it hasn't occurred in the third island, but why it has in the places that it, like, what was it that pushed it over the edge and made it happen on that one, on just those couple of islands. But yeah, I really do wonder, because superficially the habitat looks identical. You know, there's nothing. They occur in disturbed areas. I always tell people to not be, to not feel like, oh, it's so glamorous you get to work in Hawaii, because honestly, what we're doing is we're working on lawns in, you know, near buildings, you know, and plus it's dark and we're on our hands and knees in the grass. I mean, really, you could be anywhere. You know, it just doesn't matter. So you know, it's not like, you know, ooh, this is so exotic and, you know, whatever else.
So it's just a matter of chance that on 2 of the 3 islands it has happened, and on the 3rd one it hasn't yet.
Yeah, and so and I think the only reason that we even noticed that, because once we saw the mutation to begin with, then it was like every cricket that you collect, you stare at, because before that you can just glance at them and you can, you know, like male, female, you know, why would you need to look at the details of their wing morphology? I mean, it is obvious when you look very closely at it, but I suspect, you know, for all I know, there could have been 1% or 2% of males with this mutation. All the time I was working there, I just never noticed it, because why would you? You know, you don't look. Yeah. So that was the other thing that was kind of fun about this, is that it made me realize that there was all this interesting variation happening, that, you know, you just make a lot of assumptions about the way you think a system works, and it was a good lesson in making sure you didn't do that too much.
It's just so amazing that you observe this evolution happening in such a smaller period of time.
Yeah, you know, but see, so in a way it's amazing, but then in a way you think, well, okay, I bet this happens a lot, and if no one's around to see it, why would you know? It's not like people are studying like every kind of organism in detail. You know, I mean, that's one of the things that biologists always complain about, and I think sometimes it's funny that the general public often thinks biologists really know, boy, we know everything about all these animals, and we know how all these animals work, and in fact, we don't even know how many kinds of animals there are. We certainly don't know, you know, I mean, I study insects. People, you know, argue about the number of species of insects there are in the world by an order of magnitude. So people, you know, like, okay, there's probably 1 million. Some people think there are 10 million kinds of insects. Some people think there aren't 10 million kinds of animals. But, you know, like when you've got a state of ignorance that's that great, not knowing whether any individual population is showing evolution doesn't start sounding that improbable anymore. And I always find it funny because I think people who are not scientists or people who don't study animals often give us way more credit for understanding animals or understanding nature than we really deserve, because we mostly don't know things, and we mostly don't know really basic things like how an animal makes its living or where it occurs in the world. I mean, how can we not know that? People have been studying biology forever, but there's all these really basic questions that we just don't know. And that gets back to what I was also saying, that this is why I think, you have to answer this, because how can we possibly go forward unless we know the answers to these really basic questions?
Majority of the biologists ended up at the micro scale, nano scale, rather than studying macro scale more.
Well, and then there's that. I also have a very good colleague of mine at Minnesota who works on microbes, and he always maintains, everybody forgets about microorganisms, which is certainly true, and arguably they're the most important living things there are. They're essential for all other living things. So, yeah, but I don't study microbes because I don't think they're as cute. Insects,
I think one of the interesting things that comes up in this discussion is that I couldn't agree with you more about the need for a really deep understanding, and many of these wonderful discoveries like yours have come from natural history observations, right?
Exactly.
But if you or I were to submit a grant to our respective research councils saying, I really want to study the natural history of this organism, we wouldn't stand a chance. How do we get around that problem, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, to some degree, we don't need a bunch of people just getting out there and cataloging every behavior they see without any sort of conceptual or theoretical framework. I mean, that's not a solution either, right? Because that's just going to lead to a whole bunch of random observations. And I mean, the literature is probably already full of a lot of random observations that if we just knew where to find them and what to make of them, we could generate some really exciting theory. I also have some sympathy for the idea that you don't just want to say, I want to do a study just wandering around looking at crickets, because unless you have some sort of reason for doing it, I mean, there is, that saying about, chance favors the prepared mind, right? So if you're not prepared to see something and think about the context, then just doing the natural history isn't going to help.
Thank you for the quote.
I'm conscious that we're running close to the end of our session, so I'm just wondering whether anybody in the room who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet has something they'd like to ask of Marlene.
Well, I want to ask something.
Sure.
Do you think the altruisms can emerge in social instances like a colony?
That what can emerge?
Altruisms. Altruisms.
So altruism can emerge. So social insects are already pretty darn altruistic. So I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
I think she's referring to, she's making some kind of reference to the selfish gene.
Yeah.
Well, we actually study in the same university, so I know her personally. We had this professor the other day that told us that, for example, in a colony of ants, they are not really altruists, since they all have the same genes. So they sacrifice as individuals, but actually they are protecting their genes.
Yeah, so, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether you can think of a colony of social insects as being what's called a superorganism. So the idea being that, just like you're an organism composed of cells where, but you don't think of your arm doesn't do something that's in conflict with what your leg wants to do. People have suggested that in a social insect colony, all of the individuals act as though they're a body with the same interests, with the same interests for all of the individuals. And this is, people go back and forth about this. I'm probably a little bit of a conservative about it because I think that it's an analogy that's appealing, but nonetheless having a different soma, like having the genes contained in a different receptacle, as it were, still imposes some limitations on the degree to which all of the individuals can act as one. So, for example, in a honeybee colony, we know that individual females will attempt to lay eggs of their own, and that's not in the interest of the other members of the colony. And so there, again, there's this constant sort of back and forth of how it can work. So I'm probably somewhat skeptical about the idea that the colony as a whole in social insects is acting as a single organism with only the interests of the colony, you know, in mind, as it were.
Following this one, I don't remember exactly the paper what you're discussing about, but following this altruistic thing, normally people use king selection to discuss altruistic behavior in colonies, but I remember, I believe it was Stuart West, he discussed that in a paper, I think I think it was published in Science or something like that. He doesn't believe that I think he criticized this idea that, let's say, the ants, for example, actually the queen is competing against the other. I forgot the English word for the other. The operators. How do you call that?
The other reproductives. Yeah. So I do know. So there's been a recent controversy about the degree to which kin selection is important in shaping animal societies, and so I should say, so two things. One of them is that my supervisor when I did my PhD was W.D. Hamilton, who is the person that kind of originated the idea of kin selection. So I must confess to a certain degree of prejudice in this regard, in that I think that he's right, and so I still believe that kin selection is important. And the other issue is, so Stuart West, along with honestly most of the other behavioral biologists that I know and people who study social insects, disagree with the idea that kin selection is unimportant and that it doesn't explain things about social insects. And so the recent stuff that came out that, oh, it has to do with group selection and kin selection is unimportant, it's controversial, and I'm pretty much on the side of most of the rest of the scientists who say, no, kin selection is still a useful concept and we do get a lot out of applying it.
Marlene, I think we're going to wrap it up. I'm conscious of the fact that we've chatted for almost an hour.
Oh, yes.
It's been really fun. So I just want to finish by thanking you for being so generous with your time and agreeing to join us for what's been, I think, a really stimulating conversation. And I'd like to thank all of the students that came to join in the room for being part of the conversation too. We had a full room of 10 students, and we will be running further Google Hangouts later on in the course. The topic of sexual selection, I think we are going to be covering in week 5 of the course, so we look forward to that, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more discussion around that time, and we will post this Google Hangout for people to be able to enjoy and watch at a later stage. So, Marlene, thanks very much for your time.
All right, thanks for having me.
And all the best for your remaining time in Perth, and we'll hopefully see you sometime in the future.
All right.
Bye.